The first thing I must do is apologise for this very otiose title you see here before you. I didn't have my wits or wit about me when I was composing it, I think. But essentially what I want to talk to you about here this morning is, or what I want to try and do, is trace the history and ideological development of our National Museum in a way that will hopefully help us to understand the kinds of challenges that face us in the 21st century in meeting challenges of cultural diversity. Because the thing about these kinds of institutions, because they hold material culture, they're quite inertial. So they build histories as they go, histories built into objects and into selections made at moment in history. And they're not easily reconfigured according to new ideological frameworks. And these in themselves present challenges in the way we go. Now, this is a red paper because it's based on some research I've been doing, and I want to get, it's a kind of a narrative, but I think it relates to and resonates with a lot of the frameworks that have been given to us already, and I hope to allude to some of them as we go along, especially there in Peter's first presentation. I'll begin with a quote from John Dowling. In 1936, he was the arts critic of a short-lived journal, Ireland Today, and he detected an absence of character in the National Gallery, which he attributed to its history. Founded in what he called the heyday of Anglo-Irish society, he saw the gallery as a doomed to share in the sterility of that society, because it deliberately maintained an Olympian remoteness, a contemptuous aloofness from our affairs, which still contradicts its magniloquent title. So, indeed, he thought all of the national institutions similarly tainted, describing them as potential enemies, as alien now as the day we inherited them. Now, there's extraordinary hostility in that kind of reflex response to what our national institutions represented at that moment in history. But it is good to put it in a wider framework, because that kind of post-colonial hostility is something that occurs elsewhere. I'm glad to be in a position to make an Asian allusion here. In 2004, I happened to be at the International Council of Museum Conference in Seoul, in Korea, and I had my headphones on, and the director of the National Museum was speaking, and he was saying things that were making my jaw drop. So the story he was telling was how this building, which was the main administrative building, the Leinster House, if you like, of the Japanese rule of Malaysia, of Korea, from the early 20th century right through to 1945, and subsequently became the Houses of Parliament, other resonances with the Irish case there, the Houses of Parliament for Korea once it became free. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the ending of the Second World War, which was simultaneously the ending of Japanese rule, of course, in Korea, they decided to basically destroy it, to knock it down and build an entirely new museum. So we can see that these powerful colonial histories can generate very strong responses. Now, we're happy to say that in Ireland, nothing as strong as this eventuated. But nevertheless, it's good to return to the story that's going on here in Ireland. See, Dowling's bitter comment is as remarkable in a sense for its rarity as for its bluntness. In truth, for at least the first half century following the birth of the Free State in 1922, the national institutions were as much the object of public indifference as they were of government neglect. Throughout the period, there was no shortage of lively public debate on cultural matters, but it centred overwhelmingly on the intangible heritage of language and the goal of language revival, or the need to preserve a distinctively Irish and Catholic Free State government in the 1920s. The persistent, if somewhat scandalous neglect of the cultural institutions under native governments raised barely a murmur of public concern. Dowling's outburst, however, did reveal how widespread suspicion of their Anglo-Irish and Unionist origins could produce a stultifying combination of public indifference and government neglect. So, back to beginnings. The opening of the Dublin Museum of Science and Art and the National Library in new premises on Kildare Street took place in August 1890 during Horseshoe Week, the social high point of Anglo-Irish Ireland's summer season. The 1890s were probably also the high noon of Britain's cultural and political hegemony in Ireland. At the opening, the Lord Lieutenant, the Earl of Zetland, presided, and the commander of the forces in Ireland, Prince Edward of Saxe-Weimar, was present. A Highland regiment formed a guard of honour, and the band of the Gloucester Regiment provided the music for the occasion. Lord Powerscourt, a Dáin of the Anglo-Irish world, president of the museum's board of visitors, gave a speech in which he stressed the art-industrial mission of the new museum, and I quote, "If Ireland is not favoured like England with abundant mineral resources, and may not therefore hope to rival the sister isle in the extent of its manufactures, she has at least held her own in several branches of industry. The collection of this museum contains many splendid specimens of what Celtic genius has accomplished. I would specially point to the marvellous designs and workmanship of the ancient silversmiths of Ireland, to the beauty of its antique furniture, and the excellence of its textiles and manufactures." Powerscourt wove a seamless link between the superlative craftwork of the Royal Irish Academy's gold collection and the art-industrial logic of the South Kensington system, as extended to Ireland via the Dublin Museum of Science and Art. The linking of ethnic ornamentation, traditional handicrafts, and the development of an indigenous industry was a leitmotif of British colonial thinking in the 19th century, as Arindam Dutta's study of the impact of the South Kensington system on colonial India in the same period brings out. By the mid-1850s, schools of art had been set up not only in the major cities of the United Kingdom, including Dublin, but in Madras, Bombay and Calcutta. Indian artisans, spurred by uninhibited praise for their native craft traditions, were encouraged to compete in international markets without converting to machine production. Thus, Powerscourt's emphasis on the industrial potential of Ireland's craft tradition was part of the same rationale that was being applied to artisan skills in India. Indeed, the museum's collecting activity in its early years showed some enthusiasm for drawing out the affinities between Ireland and India on this basis. In 1878-9, the museum purchased 121 pieces of Indian and Persian textiles, along with ivories, ceramics, paintings and metalwork. In his annual report for the year, submitted to the parent department in London, the museum's director hoped that the recently purchased collection of mostly foreign antique lace would be highly suggestive to the lace workers of Ireland. The scenario is one in which an imperial system of museums could inspire an empire-wide small craft industry to complement the mass-produced output from the industrial heartland of Great Britain. Irish nationalists at the time were not insensitive to the imperial implications of the Dublin Museum's standing as an outpost of South Kensington. George Coffey, Honorary Secretary of the City of Dublin Workingmen's Club, warned in 1888 that the South Kensington system is an attempt to administer art as a department of government controlled from an imperial centre. He described the system as a planning machine admirably adapted to smooth off such roughness and irregularities of national and local character. Against this background, Fintan Lawler's description of the first decade or so of the museum's existence as representing gung-ho imperialism mixed with a pedagogic zeal inspired by the South Kensington ideal seems pretty just. For moderate Irish nationalists, however, there was no necessary contradiction between Ireland's claim to home rule and remaining part of the imperial project. When George Noble Count Plunkett became the museum's third and first Catholic director in 1907, he asserted his patriotism by consistently referring to the National Museum of Ireland, not the Dublin Museum of Art and Industry, but the National Museum of Ireland, in his annual reports. However, in 1914, while striving to make the Dublin Museum the Museum of Ireland, he was also enthusiastically working on enriching it as much as possible from the resources of empire. To this end, he had set up a system of exchange with colonial museums. He acknowledged in particular the help of Lord Plunkett, Governor of New Zealand from 1904 to 10, and Lord Dudley, Lord Lieutenant of Ireland from 1902 to 5, and Governor General of Australia from 1908 to 11. In return for natural history specimens, Plunkett sent facsimiles of Irish antiquities to be displayed in the colonies. So it was a fully integrated imperial museum and operated on that basis at the time. Like that other famous cultural institution founded in 1904, the Abbey Theatre, the museum occupied an ambiguous place in the cultural politics of Irish life in the years before independence. Lionel Pilkington has pointed out how the Abbey's claims to be a national theatre held out an enticing prospect of social consensus, a place where, as citizen spectators, nationalists and unionists alike could share an overarching national ideal. This is what nationalists of the time recognised as the furtively benign threat to kill Home Rule by kindness, a sly manoeuvre by British politicians to embrace both moderate nationalists and unionists in a project to make membership of the United Kingdom compatible with the imperial project. And then came the cataclysm. In 1916, Plunkett was dismissed from his post as director immediately in the wake of his son's execution, you saw him a little earlier there, for his leading role in the Easter Rising. With hindsight, the Count's dismissal can be seen as a defining moment in the history of that institution. No sooner had the museum lost its moderate nationalist figurehead than it was given over for the remainder of the war years to activities that wholeheartedly supported the war effort. In July 1916, while the country was still under general curfew following the Easter Rising, the museum staged an exhibition of shrapnel and high explosive shells, hand grenades, airplane bombs, trench mortars, time and percussion fuses, along with samples of trinitrotoluene, which is TNT to all of you. In August, the Board of Trade travelled the enemy goods exhibition to Dublin to be shown in the museum. Up to 8,000 samples of German and Austrian goods were displayed in the hope of inspiring Irish manufacturers to come up with replacement goods that would displace them in colonial and other world markets after the war, of course. So at this stage then, the adoption of a wholeheartedly pro-war exhibition policy at a time when nationalist Ireland was becoming increasingly restive following the executions at Easter tended to reinforce the impression of the museum as a unionist bastion, now divorced from even moderate nationalist feeling. An even more critical moment for the museum arrived in 1922 with the signing of the treaty and the formation of a 26-county free state. The coming of independence brought a decline in sympathy for the high arts, and particularly for the visual arts, because of their strong association with Anglo-Irish culture. On top of this, the new state's economic and industrial fabric was weakened by the destructive civil war of 1922-4, so that it lacked a manufacturing base of sufficient mass to draw upon either the design education provided by the schools of art or the exemplars of art and design to be found in the National Gallery and Museum. In any event, it did not bode well for a museum of science and art whose core mission had been to develop standards of design in Irish industry. From 1900 until 1924, the national institutions had answered to the Department of Agriculture and Technical Instruction. But under the Ministers and Secretaries Act of 1924, that department was abolished, and all the national institutions were brought together under the Department of Education. This raised the question of exactly how they were to serve the educational purposes of the new state. And as we shall see presently, there was no obvious answer to this question, and it would take 3/4 of a century to decide that they had no future in that department. Remarkably, the only time in its history that the National Museum had been subjected to a comprehensive review of its mission and ideological purpose was in 1927, when the Minister for Education, Professor J.M. O'Sullivan, set up a 5-man committee to review it. One of the members of that committee was Thomas Bodkin, the man who, over the coming 2 decades, would be the most consistent advocate for a national cultural policy that linked the development of Irish industry with instilling an appreciation of design values and the cultivation of the arts in Irish manufacturers and in the public. Born in 1887, Bodkin was a moderate Home Rule nationalist whose father had been a lawyer and Parnellite Member of Parliament. After independence, and during the years he was director of the National Gallery from 1927 to 1935, he proposed a modified version of the South Kensington Principle for a state now determined to shed all connections with the British Empire. In his report on the arts of 1948, his central proposition was that the arts were intrinsic to the nation's hopes for the development of its native industries and economic prosperity. Through his friendship with and influence upon the Taoiseach in the Inter-Party government, John A. Costello, he was in a position to ensure that this guiding rationale was enshrined in the Arts Act of 1951. This is another of our national institutions, of course, is the Arts Council. It's very important to realise that this so-called the arm's length principle, which artists today continuously refer to as enshrining the principle of freedom of expression for artists, the thought never occurred to either Bodkin or Kostler or any of the others to be concerned in any way about artistic freedom. It was solely the revitalisation of the art industry rationale that informed the setting up of the Arts Council in 1951. But unfortunately, the setting up of the Arts Council turned out to be a missed opportunity for the national institutions. In his 1948 report, Bodkin had proposed that the new cultural body, whatever that would be, would also embrace these institutions. But Costello's inter-party government chose to leave them where they were, languishing in the Department of Education. Instead, the new council was given a much narrower remit to promote the arts, with a clear injunction to promote the visual arts as a means of raising Irish standards of industrial design. At the inaugural meeting of the council in January 1952, the council's first chairman, Patrick Little, stressed that it would be paying special attention to design in industry and applied arts. This was a task the council dutifully undertook for the first 10 years of its existence, before Taoiseach Sean Lemass decided to transfer responsibility for design and industry to another agency, Chorus Trachtola, the trade division, if you like, in 1960. So that's a very important strand I think I'm tracing there about the whole art industrial logic surviving independence and being revitalised slowly and progressively through that period. But there are other strands. To return to the 1927 report, it summarily declared that the policy of the museum should be to illustrate the growth of civilization in Ireland and from Ireland outwards, and that its main purpose should be to accumulate, preserve, study and display such objects as may serve to increase and diffuse the knowledge of Irish civilization or the natural history of Ireland and of the relations of Ireland in these respects with other countries. The key phrases here are the growth of civilization in Ireland from Ireland outwards and the relations of Ireland in these respects with other countries. Now, the international psychology of this outlook had implications both for the re-evaluation of the museum's collections and also for the way in which successive governments understood the value of the national institutions in political terms. Dahl and Stade emphasise how ideas of nationality are played out both in relation to internal identity constructions and in relation to the external arenas in which political or national claims are evaluated, so that a nation's cultural status will depend on its political status in the international game of recognition. The implications of this psychology can be seen in the committee's consideration of what to do with the plaster copies of Renaissance sculpture that had been lent by the South Kensington Museum to the Dublin Museum at its foundation. The report recommended that almost all of these items be dispensed with because, quote, no student of the Italian Renaissance would come to Dublin to study from replicas. A replica collection not only encapsulated the Dublin Museum's subaltern status in the imperial system now, but lacked the potential to generate the kind of international visibility that only authentically original objects could convey. 20 years later, the museum's acting administrator, Michael Quain, cited and endorsed the views of R.A.S. McAllister, professor of Celtic archaeology at University College Dublin. According to McAllister, the medieval casual works of Italian art were quite irrelevant to the museum's purposes. He was sure that no student of these foreign arts would expect to find material sufficient for his instruction in Dublin. He had no hesitation in advising that the museum should not dissipate its energies and its funds in a vain endeavour to compete with South Kensington and other collections of general art. Against this background, it is interesting to consider the exceptional speed with which both the inter-party government of 1948 to 51 and De Valera's government of 1951 to 4 facilitated the setting up of the Chester Beatty Library. It took only 3 years from Chester Beatty's relocation to Dublin in 1950 for the library to open in August 1953, and in the process 2 Finance Acts were actually amended to meet the personal requirements of Chester Beatty. That's deluxe service if ever there were. During his speech at the opening, the Taoiseach, Eamon de Valera, referred to the library as, quote, and this, I love this phrase, a mecca for scholars in generations to come. Okay. And he thanked its owner for making our country such a centre. So there you get reinforced this whole idea that the real value of this entire collection to the place is international visibility. There is no reference whatsoever to its potential educationally, internally, to the citizenry of Ireland. Which probably explains why the museum did languish for so long in a suburb of Dublin with very poor visitorship. The wider context was one where Ireland was beginning, after years of economic protectionism before and isolation during the war, to develop its international profile. The opening of the library was bracketed by the setting up of Ireland's first arts-related body, the Cultural Relations Committee of the Department of Foreign Affairs in 1948, and of course we joined the United Nations in 1955. So it was part of a whole internationalist visibility project. But to return once again to the 1927 review, two of the committee's recommendations proved crucial in determining the future of the National Museum in a way that reverberates to the present day and with very clear implications for the subject of discussion here. The first was to place the archaeological collection at the heart of the museum's identity as a truly national museum for an independent Irish nation. This is one of the few recommendations to be immediately implemented. The gold collection was moved from, actually it was in an upstairs room as far as I understand it, to the central court on the ground floor. And by 1929, the acquisition of archaeological objects in the museum outstripped the art and industrial collection for the first time, or the collection of art industrial objects. A significant moment there, I think. The second was its only innovative proposal, that the museum should have a folklife division housing a folklife collection. The committee set an unequivocally pre-industrial boundary to the collection policy for this material. It should be confined to the period, quote, before these objects became denationalised by the machine-made mass production of foreign countries. In this schema, the material evidence for a cohesive national identity was to be found only in the prehistoric and the historic periods that preceded the Industrial Revolution. And I think that admirably illustrates your point, Peter, earlier on when you talk about young and emergent nations need the oldest histories. Ireland seemed to have been enacting that. This injunction had profound implications for the museum's subsequent capacity to engage materially with the modernisation of Irish society. The process of urbanisation that began to speed up from the 1950s onwards lay outside its remit. Ironically, only the 1916 collection that the museum began assembling in the 1930s contains objects drawn from everyday contemporary life. Here were quotidian things: hats, caps, shoes, cigarettes, box brandy cameras, and a wide variety of other bijouterie, sanctified by their association with freedom fighters, but also inadvertently, and because it just so happened that most of the leading rebels were urban dwellers, giving an impression of a modernising Ireland that bore little resemblance to the one to be captured in the folklife collections. The pre-industrial cordon sanitaire that the 1927 committee threw around the collection policies of the museum inhibited from registering forces that from the 1940s onwards were transforming folkloric Ireland through the cinema, the ballroom of romance, the motor car, and above all, emigration. Tony Bennett, the Australian cultural commentator and historian, observed a similar bias in the way Australian museums told the story of the country in the 19th century. He lamented the disproportionate concentration in the lives of pioneers, settlers, explorers, and rural industries at the expense of 20th century urban history, describing the process in a phrase that might just as easily have applied to museological practice in Ireland in the 20th century. He called it the rural gerrymander. Remarkably, though the museum began to put together a folklife collection almost immediately, it failed for half a century to implement the proposal to set up a folklife division, only eventually doing so in 1974. Anno Dowd has suggested that the reason for this was that a collection of this kind would have highlighted the lamentable state of poverty in which many people in rural Ireland lived, rather than celebrated the land of frugal comforts that De Valera was inclined to find in his heart. And this is the point where I want to stop for a moment, just to De Valera made this extraordinary statement in 1922, in the height of the debates leading to civil war, that if he wanted to know what the Irish people wanted, all he had to do was to look into his own heart. Which can strike you on the one hand as the most vaingloriously egocentric statement ever made. But I think there's more to it. I think it's there's a Weltanschauung idea going on there, that a true nation, a true people commune with each other in a way that they instinctively know each other. And that was also a reciprocal relation, that their hearts also throbbed with a similar recognition. And that, I think, is the subtlety of what he was trying to say. But its implications for museums are really interesting, because if you do set a pre-industrial cordon sanitaire to what museums are about, that means that museums can only be repositories of that which is already consigned to the past, that other country. And that the existential energies of the society were to be poured into the intangible heritage project of reviving the Irish language and keeping alive a set of traditional cultures and practices in Irish society, such that to have consigned materials from that living culture to a museum would have been virtually to have confirmed it as dead. So I think there was a psychological barrier to actually transferring that, and I think that partly explains why a decision to set up a folklife division in 1927 takes 50 years to actually implement. It's quite extraordinary in that regard. From the 1960s onwards, Ireland underwent rapid economic and cultural development, accompanied by the many traumatic identity questions thrown up by 30 years of strife in Northern Ireland. Ireland's urban population surpassed its rural population for the first time in 1967, and by 2011, 62% of the population would be urban dwelling. The National Museum was ill prepared to reflect these changes and adapt to unfolding debates about identity and history. It would take time to free itself of these pre-modern constraints just discussed, and from a bias in its near-contemporary collecting towards fine art and design specimens that militated against assembling a collection to reflect the social and cultural evolution of the country in the 20th century. When the new museology took hold in the 1990s, it demanded a reflexive curatorial practice that acknowledged how the past is reproduced and reinterpreted as part of contemporary cultural and political discourse. It required embarking upon what Henrietta Litchi has called an anthropology of the self, a process that encouraged an outsider perspective on indigeneity. The comparatively non-reflexive discipline of folklore perhaps inhibited the museum from developing in this direction. It did not employ, nor does it to this day, a professional anthropologist who is not also a folklorist in that sense. A further constraint is the museum's continuing adherence to the Victorian collection categories under which it was set up in the mid-19th century: antiquities, natural history, art and industry, with the addition of folklife in the 1970s. Over the past 20 years or so, Ireland has undergone demographic and cultural changes, so radical as surely to make reflexive curatorial practices a requirement for all Irish museums. Since the 1990s, the country has transitioned from being a virtually homogeneous society to one of considerable diversity. Between 2002 and 2006, the number of non-Irish nationalists living here increased by 87%. Between 2006 and 11, that number increased by a further 30%. The foreign-born portion of our population is now 12% of the total. And of course, we are no longer a homogeneously Catholic society. In 2015, we became the first country in the world to permit same-sex marriage in a referendum. At this point, it's appropriate to acknowledge the role that contemporary art museums such as the Douglas Hyde Gallery, founded in 1978, the RHA Gallery in 1985, and IMA in 1990, and indeed the Hugh Lane Gallery, now that Barbara's in the room as well, have played in providing a platform for contemporary artists to explore the existential resonances of history and memory through their work. I particularly want to mention this fantastic exhibition last year of Dorothy Crosses, which is one of the best history exhibitions, along with one of the best art exhibitions that I think I've seen in the country, where objects were drawn from all of our national institutions and worked along with some of our own artistic creations to produce this extraordinary set of reflections on the history of these objects. And as time is moving on, I shall move along. It's encouraging to see that the national institutions have been striving in recent years to come to terms with the nature of these changes in contemporary Irish life. This is evident from the strategic plans they have produced over the past decade. And I'm not trying to curry favour here, but I think it's fair to say that this institution, the Chester Beatty Library, has been leading the way in this regard. Its strategic plan for 2013 to 15 surpasses that of other national institutions for the explicitness and specificity of its commitment to serving a culturally diverse society. The plan not only commits to promoting intercultural dialogue and learning, it specifies real and measurable actions for achieving it. Quote, to design an intercultural learning zone for the website, to develop educational resources for students, educators and learners, to target cross-cultural audiences, to maintain contact with existing audiences and cultivate new audiences. The National Museum's development in this area has been slower but nonetheless appreciable. Its statement of strategy for 2008 to 12 contained a broad acknowledgement that Ireland was an increasingly diverse society that presented opportunities for the museum to make the collections relevant and responsive to that diversity. The nature of that diversity, however, remained unspecified, as did the actions and objectives that might credibly address it. However, the museum's latest statement of strategy for 2014 to 17 is much stronger. It declares a clear intention to embrace change and devise a model for the museum appropriate to the conditions and challenges of the 21st century. Against the backdrop of the extensive discussion of the early 1927 report, it's very encouraging to see the Museum of Country Life, which is a department of the National Museum, taking a leading role in implementing an exhibition policy that seeks to explore the changing and diversifying face of rural Ireland. At present, it has a small but wonderful exhibition entitled Migrant Women, Shared Experiences. According to the museum website, this exhibition explores the rich traditions of 8 women from around the world living in Mayo today. Surprisingly, the National Galleries of Ireland has the least to say on this subject. Its strategic plan for 2012 to 15, which is the latest one I can find, has no reference at all to the issue of cultural diversity. Now, in conclusion, it would be naive to look to our museums as engineers of social and cultural change in their own right. But it remains perfectly reasonable for citizens to expect our national institutions, with their central role in shaping our image of ourselves through material culture, to be responsive to social and cultural change in Irish life. More widely, there is a pressing need to coordinate cultural policies across a much wider range of government departments to ensure a coherent and integrated approach to serving the cultural rights of citizens. There is a particularly urgent challenge, I think, in the field of tourism. It continues to generate essentialist images of a primordial, homogeneous Ireland that belie the actual tourist encounters that people are having with an industry whose frontline staff comes increasingly from other countries. In 2004, a Fall to Ireland report revealed that the tourism industry in Ireland employed over 25,000 international workers and was by a wide margin the leading employer of a diverse workforce in Ireland. There is some hope that a comprehensive cultural policy that the Department of Arts, Heritage and the Gaeltacht has been widely consulting on for the past 6 months will provide a basis for this much-needed integrative approach. The current draft of Culture 2025, as the document states, the government recognises that culture has an important role to play in social integration and affords the opportunity to acknowledge Ireland's shift to a multicultural society and to recognise the value of diverse cultural influences. These are all the correct sentiments that should be built into Ireland's cultural policies henceforward. The challenge is to find an effective alignment between our cultural aspirations for a diverse Ireland and cultural services that translate them into a credible, inclusive image of contemporary Ireland. And I think I'll end there. Sorry.